We're going to reconvene our meeting, continue about S100 with Sarah Phillips. Yeah, she's still in the room on Zoom.
All right, are you ready for me?
We are ready for you.
Great. Okay. I'm Sarah Phillips. I'm the director of the State Office of Economic Opportunity in the Department for Children and Families in the Agency of Human Services. And as I understand it, I'm speaking today with you about the small portion of the bill that has to do with zoning and emergency shelters. So I have some slides I can just quickly go through to provide some context, and then happy to answer any questions the committee might have.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Share screen. Oh yeah. Okay, great. So knowing that I'm not often in front of your community, but wanted to provide just some overview of sort of what emergency shelter looks like in Vermont. I think that's important to understand. So we have about 28 emergency shelters in Vermont. They vary in terms of the model. This is Upper Valley Havens in the Hartford area. This is one of their shelters. Shelters are both congregate and semi-congregate facilities. This includes domestic and sexual violence shelters. We also have a number of seasonal warming shelters. All of them by design are intended to be temporary and to help guests move into permanent housing as quickly as possible. This is Lamoille Community House in Hyde Park. Shelters don't solve homelessness. We're very clear about that in our field, but they keep people from being unsheltered, and they're a really critical part of the safety net in Vermont. They're really about connecting people to resources and services and supporting them on their journey. This is at the Bennington County Coalition for the Homeless on Main Street in Bennington. Right now, January, well, this is January 2023, hasn't changed much for April. We have about capacity to serve about a little over 500 households in emergency shelter across the state. 32 of those beds are seasonal only. Some of them are just winding down right about now, actually closing for the season. In January 2020, right, our pre-COVID data, just for some context, we could serve about 562 households statewide. But a huge portion of that was just seasonal capacity. And then, of course, in May 2020, you can see the impact of the pandemic, how much capacity we kind of quickly lost during the height of the pandemic. When our emergency shelters are full, just to be really clear, that's when, and there's no appropriate emergency shelter bed in a community, that's when we put people up in emergency housing through a motel stay, right? So it's shelter first and then overflow into hotels. And right now, there's about 2,400 households experiencing homelessness in Vermont. You can see that our emergency shelters represent our housing about a fifth of that population. Over half of the households who are homeless are in hotel, or I'm sorry, 3/4 of the households who are homeless are in motels right now. And we do still have some folks who are unsheltered. So we're doing a lot to really preserve and expand emergency shelter, because you can see from the last slide that we just don't have enough capacity across the state to meet the needs. And we're doing a lot to help renovate existing facilities as well. So it's not just about expanding the capacity, it's about preserving it as well. The pandemic's really pushed us to think differently about shelter in the state of Vermont, and we've moved towards less congregate settings. One of the barriers, though, around shelters is their ability to operate 24/7. We actually have some zoning restrictions in the state of Vermont that prohibit the ability for shelters to operate 24/7. Oh, and say that's the picture of in Berlin, the Welcome Center operated with goods. The reality is we've actually have 9 new shelter sites that have stood up around the state. And when I say we, I mean the collective we. I'll speak to that in a moment. DCF doesn't go around and take over land and stand up shelters. This is the collective we. But 9 new sites between 2020 and 2022. I want to be really clear, this is an equity issue. Families and communities are both better off when people experiencing a housing crisis can stay near their jobs, their schools, their doctors, their family and friends, and other services. And we have a lot of communities in Vermont where we don't have enough capacity. And the impact is that families and individuals have to be housed 2, sometimes 3 counties away from where their communities are. That's disruptive to communities in Vermont. It doesn't just impact those families negatively. And I just want to lift that up, is that when we cannot place shelters in the areas where we need them, that's really problematic. So here's the reality. Shelters develop out of local partnerships, right? The community comes together, they understand and identify gaps, they work to right-size shelter capacity, to follow best practices, and to expand capacity. This is Tim's house in downtown St. Albans. The state role in shelters is to provide planning support, data analysis. We provide a lot of technical assistance on best practices, and we make sure that our providers understand the funding requirements, but we're really there to partner. There are a lot of examples in this state. I've been in this work for a long time now, where communities have come together based on identified, clearly defined needs and have not been able to site a shelter due to restrictions in the local communities. I just want to, this is a Main Street shelter operated by COTS for families in Chittenden County. You can get a sense of the variety of shelter models. I think the reality is, again, we don't think that we can solve homelessness with emergency shelters. We solve homelessness with housing, and the other aspects of this bill are really important to address our housing crisis. The shelter field and community and DCF, we're responding to a housing crisis. Fundamentally, we just need much, much more affordable housing in the state of Vermont. The length of time people experience homelessness in the state has more than tripled in the past 4 years. It's because there's no housing. I think Sue spoke very eloquently to that. Just to highlight the section of the bill that does seek to address the issue of siting of emergency shelters. And then I'll just, I can stop sharing for a moment and let me see. Happy to answer any questions, but I think more to the point, I just want to be really clear that there are, it takes years, and there are some communities where they've been working more than years to site shelters. I want to name things like character of the neighborhood as specific reasons why there's an unwillingness to site shelter. This is NIMBYism beyond what's experienced with affordable housing in the state of Vermont. Character of the neighborhood was cited as a reason that they would not allow for an expansion of shelter on an existing shelter site in Hartford, Vermont. I think it's just really problematic, and I want to lift it up. I appreciate that this language is still in the bill and moving forward, and just want to highlight the importance of it moving forward. So happy to answer any other questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I have a question. I don't know that I understand exactly the restriction on 24-hour, 7-day-a-week on a shelter that's housing homeless people. What would close? How could it close?
Maybe I don't understand your question, sorry. How could the shelter close during the day?
Is that what it means? It closes during the day?
Yeah, that's what it means. It says that, and the reality is people need shelter, not just overnight, but during the daytime hours. But yes, we have restrictions placed on shelters that says that they can only provide evening shelter, which means that folks need to exit in the morning and aren't allowed to come back until the evening.
And that's done through zoning, that restriction?
Through permitting processes, yes, conditional use, perhaps. I'd have to look into the specific examples, but yes, that is one example that absolutely happens. And it places the burden of fighting for the right to operate on the shelter provider specifically, who's day in, day out trying to meet the basic needs of some vulnerable Vermonters. And I think we just need to address that issue fundamentally.
Can you give a number to the amount of shelters that haven't been able to be open that folks wanted to open?
Number, I think that's hard. I think, our emergency shelter operators would be best positioned to tell their own stories. I can speak to, current projects in development. I think in Lamoille, I shared a picture of Lamoille Community House. That's at a site that operates only seasonally because they aren't allowed to operate year round. They have been working over the past 3 years to identify a site and that they can be able to operate year round, expand capacity. I think they're set to hopefully open this fall with capacity to serve 16 or 20 individuals, and they have some funding from VHCB, but they looked at dozens of possible sites in Lamoille County. They're definitely facing opposition in the site that they've identified now, and I'm not sure if they're still in the appeals process, but that's an example of one community, 3 years to try to stand up that capacity. In St. Johnsbury, essentially the shelter has been relegated to the part of town that is in the healthcare district, where there's very little, it's outside of the main part of town where people would need to access other services and supports. There's very little developable land within that area. They have been searching for, they had operated a seasonal site at a shelter that at a site owned by the hospital, a hospital property prior to COVID that closed down. They've been looking for another site to be able to operate a shelter for adults in St. Johnsbury. Again, they're restricted to that part of the, also the seasonal shelter was not allowed to operate during the daytime hours, but they, thankfully they have a project they're hoping to move forward with some funding this fall. That's been several years. Those are just two examples. In Hartford, they've wanted to expand capacity at the Upper Valley Haven campus to provide seasonal capacity for adults during the coldest months of the year. That project didn't move forward, was blocked through the zoning process. So, those are just some very specific examples just within the past few years, and Bennington as well, and their siting of their shelters. It's been a challenge as they seek to preserve capacity as they've lost some capacity and have tried to stand up others. Every area of the state, this is an issue. So those are just some specific examples.
Thank you. That's a good answer for my question. Do members have questions? Representative Bonner. Oh.
Representative Logan has a question.
Oh, thanks. Sorry.
There's no raise on the training position.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Kate's going to read a question from our representative, who's also named Kate. Our committee assistant will read the question.
So she asked, how many homeless households currently shelter in hotels while waiting for permanent housing and are expected to potentially lose their hotel shelter in the coming year?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? So there are changes to general assistance emergency housing program administered by the Department of Children and Families that are coming during the current year. There's changes that will be happening on June 1st, and then changes that presumably will be happening on July 1st. I will say what happens in state fiscal year 24 is still under discussion in the legislature. OEO doesn't administer the General Assistance Emergency Housing Program. It is several hundred households that will no longer be eligible in June, but I don't have more specific for that program. Some of those households will exit into shelter capacity to the extent that it's available. Generally, our shelters are operating at near 100% capacity most nights. So that's, I can follow up with some more specific data points for Kate or the committee if helpful.
Thank you.
Sue Minter says.
I think Sue Minter, that's what, Representative Morris noted that it was in Sue Minter's written testimony. Okay. Thank you again for your testimony.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for your due diligence on this bill.
Next up, we have Jay Green. Welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me. It's very much appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony on behalf of the Office of Racial Equity. My name is Jay Green. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the policy and research analyst for the office. I wanted to focus in, so the mission of the, let me just get my notes ready again here.
Sure.
So the mission of the Office of Racial Equity is to work on dismantling systems of systemic racism that may exist throughout the state government, including the legislature. So I wanted to take this opportunity to point out an instance where there are racial disparities created by the statutory language. And that is specifically, if you look under section 6, that's 24 VSA 4465, appeals of the decisions of the administrative officer. I apologize that I don't have a page number.
Christie's memorized the bill. That's good work.
Yes, so this refers to this language refers to who is allowed to appeal decisions of the administrative board, and so an interested person, according to the subsection B1, is a person owning title to property, municipal or solid waste management district, et cetera. But then if you go down to section 4, I'm not actually talking about what has been added in this bill, any 10 persons who allege a common injury to a particular interest. I'm specifically referring to who may be any combination of voters or real property owners within a municipality listed in subdivision 2 of this subsection. So the sticky wicket there is voters and real property owners, because Vermont has serious racial disparities in the property ownership department. The 2021 American Community Survey 5-year estimate found that 73% of white Vermonters own their home, compared to only 26% of Vermont residents who identified as Black or African American alone. And other people of color in Vermont also report lower home ownership rates than white people in Vermont. So restricting the appeals process to only voters and real property owners is going to have a racially disparate impact on people of color in Vermont. So I spoke with Executive Director of Racial Equity, Susanna Davis, about this, and she said that she's in favor of keeping the appeals process because we do want people to have the opportunity to make comments on the review process. But the office strongly feels that there needs to be a change to that language about voters and real property owners, because voters also is disproportionately exclusive of people of color in Vermont, because people, like, for example, people who have a green card, so they're lawful permanent residents, but they still don't have the ability to vote. So they may live in Vermont, but they don't have a voting rights. So you could be a green card. You could have a green card, and be a resident of a town that's planning a development and want to appeal, you not be able to because you're not a voter. Yeah, and that also excludes people who are undocumented. So there's a couple of issues there. I did note that under section 19 on page 31, line 19, there's a different definition of an interested person, which is a person owning title to or occupying property within or abutting the designated area. So I wanted to highlight that as a possible remedy that occupying property might be something that's a little bit more inclusive that could help to broaden who can make an appeal to include more people who potentially don't own property in Vermont. And then other than that, and I'm happy to submit these comments in writing. As you can see, I have a draft before me that is not quite finished yet. There is kind of an outstanding question there about what does it mean to just occupy property? How long does someone need to be occupying that property to make an appeal, for example, and how much proof is sufficient to prove that someone is occupying a property? So that might be something for the legislature to consider defining further, what it means to occupy a property and how long someone needs to be there to do that. And what proof do they need to provide in order to go through the appeals process. But other than that, I wanted to comment on several appropriations and sections that have been re-added to the current draft of this bill that is before the committee today that were stripped from the version as passed by the Senate, I believe, that the office supports. We want to encourage, the office encourages the committee to retain section 27 of this bill, which includes a fiscal year 24 general fund appropriation to the Vermont Human Rights Commission to create a new full-time exempt housing discrimination litigator position. The Office of Racial Equity works very closely with the Human Rights Commission, and we want to support our colleagues ask for a new housing discrimination litigator, because as we expand, hopefully, the amount of housing in Vermont, we want to make sure that people are protected from discriminatory renting and practices in general related to housing. We also wanted to specifically highlight our support for the funding allocations to the Vermont Housing Finance Agency for the first generation home buyer program. That program was created under Act 182 of 2022, and we're encouraged to see it continue to be funded for another fiscal year. There have been some other programs that the legislature has funded for 1 year only that are related to diversity and equity, and we wanted to highlight that this is a good opportunity to prove your investment in diversity and equity through the funding allocations process. There's also section 36, the middle income homeownership development program, and section 38, the rental housing revolving loan program. So wanted to express the Office of Racial Equity support for these programs that are specifically dedicated to uplifting and empowering people in low and middle income communities to purchase homes or resist being evicted. So yeah, that is the total of the testimony on behalf of the office, but I'm happy to take any further questions if the committee is interested in asking.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you very much.
Do members have questions? I don't see any. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Right. Well, we have about half an hour until the next witness is scheduled. Commissioner Hannaford, would you want to testify? You would have maybe a little less. I mean, we could give you half an hour still if you're available now.
Sure, absolutely. Oh, bless you. Okay, twice. Bless you. I was just going to say.
Welcome.
Thank you. For the record, Josh Hanford, Commissioner of Housing and Development. And I was kind of invited a little bit last minute today, so I don't have written testimony and not going to line by line, just more big picture sort of champion this bill and talk about the administration's perspective in the big picture. Happy to answer any questions along the way, though, at any point. Just want to give a little bit of background about myself, because I don't think I'm in here very often. It's not usually where we talk a lot about a lot of housing and community development work. But as Chair Sheldon knows, we worked on natural resource stuff 20 years ago in the White River Valley, and worked on riparian buffers and water quality testing and all kinds of stuff. And sort of my first 10 years in Vermont was more about natural resource and rural economic development sort of work. And as my career sort of moved on, I became more and more involved in housing development, affordable housing funding, policy work with federal funds from Department of Housing and Urban Development, and then all of our housing partners here in Vermont, and then working with practically every community in the state as the community development director, Vermont Community Development Director for 10 years, providing federal grants to address the community development needs of these communities. And the theme kept marching on: housing, 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 affordable housing, not enough housing is being built. Moved along my career and was appointed deputy commissioner under Governor Shumlin. And that carried on under Governor Scott. We had the large Housing for All revenue bond, which sort of was the biggest investment at the time, ended up being about $37 million. That soon was very clear that was just a drop in the bucket of the need. And then in 2019, became the Commissioner of Housing and Community Development. And then, March 2020 rolled around, and sort of the pandemic really highlighted just how dire our housing situation was. And that if you looked at the data for the last 4 decades, really, we've been underbuilding by quite a bit. If you look at the last decade alone, the data is somewhere around, our net housing growth was 0.18%, meaning we were barely adding any new housing stock. When you consider what was being lost from our housing due to, just falling apart, it's not available anymore, conversion to something else, and then the net new housing. And that was all housing. And so you can really see this drop off from the early 80s to where we are now.
Can you say that number one more time?
0.18% of growth in housing stock for the last decade. So that was for the whole decade. That was the total net growth. So each year, you can summarize this in residential building permits. Back in the 80s, they were close to 5,000 permits a year. In the last decade, it's been under 2,000 a year, more like 1,300 a year. And so you could just see the drop. And there's a lot of factors out there, but one thing we, had heard repeatedly over and over again is, well, we don't have enough housing money going into the system. Well, I think the last 5 years has changed that. We've seen almost $500 million into the affordable housing development, and some of that money is still available. VHCV has resources they're still making available. We have some resources for the VHIP program, from a housing improvement program, which is a smaller up to $50,000 grant loan to match with private owners to bring housing stock back online. Essentially, existing housing stock that has fallen in disrepair, is vacant, is abandoned. It needs some upkeep and reinvestment, because during our years, we do a housing needs assessment every 5 years to maintain our federal funding. And the last needs assessment showed that Vermont had almost 19,000 housing units that were substandard. So we figured the best solution here, the lowest hanging fruit, was design a program to reutilize that existing housing stock. Meets a lot of goals from a lot of folks. There's a lot of opportunity out there. And it's been very successful. I would argue we needed this 10, 15 years ago to not end up in the situation we're in. But that doesn't work everywhere in the state. You have some parts of the state where they need net new units, and they needed them yesterday. You can't just repurpose or bring back online units that have fallen into disrepair. And so a variety of solutions to address the housing needs through resources, through new money. But with the rising costs of everything from labor to materials to supply shortages, and yes, regulations, zoning, Act 250, has become the area that government can control the most. We can't control global supply of X widget that goes into housing construction. We can't control labor costs. In fact, I think we're benefiting from people receiving some higher wages. but we can control the cost of development on the side of regulatory framework. And there's national numbers from the National Home Builders and Remodelers Association that say about 25% of the cost of building a new home is embedded in regulations. You often hear it as the 4 or 5 L's, lumber, land, labor, and laws, they call it. Laws being the regulatory framework. So sort of in my career of working in natural resource work, conservation, community development, and housing work, I've sort of seen this shift in my thinking and beliefs, really, that we have done a better job in Vermont of ensuring we value our natural resources, protect them, maybe above our housing goals and our housing needs. I think that there's often communities often have conservation commissions, much more before they have a housing commission. They often have all these other councils and efforts, and housing is just supposed to be left up to the free market, right? Someone builds a house for you, you pay for it to rent or buy, and it solves itself. Well, it's not. I mean, the market is really broken in a lot of ways. It costs a lot more to build a home than the working class family can afford. We have unique programs in S100 and started last year to subsidize that cost of development versus what a median income family can afford. But it's still the government interventions on paying the subsidy and to pay for the broken market. It is not going to get us out of this situation. We need to address some of these regulatory issues. I was just reading over here a new article from Pew Trust that did a study on 4 locations: Minneapolis, New Rochelle, New York, Portland, Oregon, and Tysons, Virginia. They've all had substantial upzoning and deregulation of housing development in those communities, and they have studied and found where they removed barriers to where you can build a home and how many. They've seen a de-escalation in rent between only 1% and 7%, whereas the same period, the national average increase in rent is 30%. I'm happy to share this, but this is just one data point of many that, yes, more supply does work. It actually does bring down the cost to people. And some of the other testimony I heard and is heard throughout this sort of argument and debate about, does local zoning, does Act 250 have impact on housing? And if we just allow more housing to be built anywhere, isn't it just going to go to second homeowners or those various arguments? I'd just like to mention a couple things on that point that I think our existing regulatory framework, both local zoning and Act 250, has worked very well for second homeowners. There's nothing that in my experience they enjoy more than less dense housing that's spread out and that reduces the economies of scales of building 25 versus 9 or 10 units. We have the second highest rate of second homes in the nation, only behind Maine, and New Hampshire's third. Some folks will point to short-term rentals, as in having an impact here. It has an impact, but I would argue that they only represent 3% of our housing stock, and half of that is in existing vacation homes. So it's really impacting 1.5% compared to 17% of our housing being owned by second homeowners. And that's been a tradition here for over a century, really. If you look at Northern New England being a place where folks had second homes. And so some of what this bill and amendments that have been floating around are trying to do is open that stock, build more, and that the density and that the economies of scale of building more housing in more places will help and will be available to lower incomes. The compromises that have been reached in the Senate, passing out of Senate Natural Resources to allow some of this increased Act 250 thresholds in the designated areas is great. It's just, I think there needs to be some level setting here that all those designated areas combined in the entire state added up is 0.3% of the land area. It's not enough. I think that we often think our designated areas or what we think are our built environment in our downtown. They're not. You can be on this side of the street and you're in designated area, and on this side, you're not. Because they weren't designed, with the exception of the neighborhood development area, the newest one that's only been around for a couple of years, they were not designed to allow housing development. They were designed for commercial and civic cores, to allow historic tax credits to fix up those buildings and other goals. It's been used as a proxy of places we agree that are smart growth, but there simply is not enough area in those areas to adequately build the housing we need, let alone with an equity lens that all the new housing we're going to allow to be built is in the most dense part of the state, and it's going to be apartments because that's all the room for. And we shouldn't allow other housing types and choice across the state. You know, even Burlington, largest city in the state, their total designated areas in the whole city of Burlington, all three of them that they have, only add up to 14% of Burlington's area. Yet 40% of Burlington's land mass has some sort of permanent conservation land. So they literally have more land permanently conserved than land that is in a designation sort of with some easier passes to development. If you looked across the communities that in the designations we have, you would find a very similar situation. So I just think we need to be real with ourselves that 0.3% of our land area, we're going to struggle to try to provide the housing we need for all the types of people that need housing. And the frustration I see and express when I'm in committees, whether it's in the legislature or at town, speaking to town officials, is the sort of debate around, well, it's okay to build this housing here and this type of housing can be here, and we're okay seeing people live here. And you're talking about where people are going to sleep at night. You're talking about people's homes. And if we see it on this hillside, it might be ugly and we would oppose that. I think that we're fooling ourselves if we're not going to be okay with seeing more housing to solve this problem. And I understand we have, long traditions I support of keeping rural working lands and historic settlement patterns, but we also have historic settlement patterns that even those historic settlement patterns do not have the ability to build the housing we need, because those historic settlement patterns aren't encompassed in these designation areas. They're bigger than those. And we don't have a path to get there quickly with the compromises that have been made as the bill exited Senate Natural Resources to address the housing we need, in my opinion. We still have this exclusionary development pattern in Vermont that if you can afford enough to purchase 5-10 acres, you can have your housing needs met. But if you can't afford that, we're going to try to fit you in an apartment building that some affordable housing developer is going to build for you with 100% public funding. And that's been our solution to addressing the housing problem. And I think we need to be a little bit more realistic around knocking down barriers, trying to help the market work better. Yes, guiding to at least impactful places that we have concerns about impacts to our natural resources, but there's going to be a little give and take in this work. So I'm happy to answer questions. I just wanted to speak broadly about this. And there's references when we hear debates about Act 250 in particular doesn't add any cost or time. That is just roundly rejected from my view. We have a study that the legislature asked us to do 6 years ago. It's old. The costs are higher than they were then. It's called the Act 157 study that showed it typically added 6 months to a housing development and tens of thousands of dollars, depending on how big it was. Forget that the Act 250 fee, just the application fee alone, is a cost-based application. And it went up during this time by 25% of what it was when that study was done. And so if an average housing unit is costing about $500,000 to build now, even an apartment, and you're doing a 10-unit development, the fee alone is close to $75,000, not to mention all the other permits that you're going to need to get along the way. and the time. And if you go into the next construction season, time is money, development, pressures are real and these costs add up. And folks can easily avoid that. Just stay under 9 units and build 9 big homes that aren't going to be available for folks that are moderate, lower income. And you don't have to take that risk and add that added cost. I think it's not getting us the type of development we actually want and serving the type of people we serve in Vermont. And we can't keep doing the same thing and expect it to change because this problem has been growing for 40 years.
Thank you for your testimony. I'm interested in the Pew study that you referenced, and also if you, it seems, I'd be interested if you have specific language that you're.
I will send you that study. I can send the Act 157 report, and my team at the department has some small technical changes. I think I've been working with a few folks on here. Just to help make some of the provisions that we all support work a little bit better. I know things are moving very fast. I believe that the compromise that I've heard that maybe the Rural Caucus is proposing would add a little bit more to this Act 250 sort of relief valve that I think is needed with still this window. I think the administration's view is we actually aren't doing enough in this bill, Act 250. But this has been a broad compromise, a broad coalition to try to work around things. Not everyone is getting what they want. There's parts of this bill that the administration is absolutely not really in support of, but we're sort of biting our lip because we're getting this and that. And then in the whole, this is good for housing. And so the Rural Caucus sort of amendments that are floating out there, I don't know if anything's official yet, based on what happened in the Senate by Senator Chittenden. It's a building upon that, adds a little bit more Act 250 deregulation for communities that have permanent planning and zoning for a period of time while these studies happen. I think is the direction that I would urge the committee to consider. Think about really what kind of developments are going to be able to take place in that period. Are we really going to change the state in these 3 years, or are we going to learn something and maybe relieve some of this very concerning with still having 2,500 households that are homeless at this point in time, and having another 2 years of extraordinary federal money to build affordable housing that will often be targeted at all of these priority areas. I mean, that is where we target these funds. And there's no benefits in those areas that aren't, I'm not being very clear here. All of the funding that we use, public funding to support housing development, has these principles of putting it in smart growth locations. They're all the funders prioritize, and that's where we try to build this housing. So the relief you're giving outside of those areas, we're not going to be targeting folks that building in those areas. I still think the majority of this 3-year sort of pause, if you will, while we study, is going to happen in the places we want it to happen the most. That was a very way to summarize.
I have just a couple more maybe, but this is just a curiosity if you could. I'm back to the kind of substandard houses inventory. I've been thinking about the multifaceted causes of the situation we find ourselves in. And I really do appreciate that work. And I'm also wondering about unintended consequences of other programs. Like there are a lot of empty houses around neighborhoods. People talk about them. They're not necessarily substandard, but they're just not being used at all. And in one instance that I know of anyway, it just came to my attention that there's someone in a nursing home and Medicaid somehow is involved in restricting the use of that home. So I don't know where I would get to. Who would I ask that question to?
Interesting. I mean, we do see homes that, are bank owned. There's some ownership structure that's hard to find the owner to try to get something happen in it. I know Representative Woods on the Housing Committee has one on the end of her street that she's literally personally for 10 years been trying to have something done about. And the city of Rutland is being much more aggressive of eminent domain, taking property that people aren't settling up on taxes. It's been vacant, and they're selling them to developers with a year. You have a year to redevelopment and put it in use in order to sort of move this along and get a deal from the city. I think there's more creativity that could be done around that. But it's hard. I can walk my neighborhood and see a home or two that is vacant, no one being used, not being used. And it's not like it's a second home where it's just literally just sitting there.
Everyone I talk to says that.
Yeah.
I can say the same thing.
Yeah.
There's just empty houses.
Yeah. I can tell you that this VHIP program, we're at about 408 back in January. The data I just saw is another like 215 on top of that 408 that are coming online. And these are all properties that were vacant for whatever reason. Most of the time they were in such poor condition they couldn't possibly be habitable in code. Sometimes it's not as bad as you think. You open a wall and they have old tube and knob wiring, and that's a 30,000 job for a whole, big Victorian that's a two bedroom apartments to fix. But other times it's been a conversion of a general store that's gone out of business long ago, but it could be a couple apartments, and it has to be existing properties right now. And I think incentives go a long way to have people come to the table. But you're right. There are weird situations of it's an estate-owned property, the bank owns it, and you just can't get control of it. And I wish I had an answer. I think the answer is promote these incentives, have them ongoing, and try to make people aware of them. The ADUs is another accessory dwelling units that we're using VHIP for. We're seeing a big uptick of that. And these are ones that are permanent. They're not going for short-term rental because we have conditions on them. It's recorded in the land records. There's a covenant on them. When the property changes hands, they have to, sign off from us, and it goes to the new owner, their conditions. And so it's a way to address these concerns of short-term rentals, second homeowners, taking this low-hanging fruit and turning it into investment property. Come on. We can't stop that. What we can do is provide incentives for folks to serve folks that live here by helping to sort of partner with them on covering some of those costs, because the rents are going to be affordable. So they're not going to be able to, go to the bank, borrow a bunch of money, jack the rents up to $2,000 or $3,000 and make that back. We're partnering with them. They're keeping the rents at, most cases it's $900 or below, maybe $1,000 or below, but it's a nice new apartment and it's got a 10-year affordability for 10% of what it costs to build new through the traditional affordable housing system, as well as revitalized neighborhoods. Grand list goes up. The neighbor's happy that house is repurposed and looks good. And so, I think that is a ongoing strategy that we have to continue to support.
One more from me, and then I know there's others, but 500 million into housing in the last 5 years. What can we expect from that?
Yeah, so the estimates early on, and this has sort of been building. It didn't start out as 500 million. And our goal was 5,000 net new units. When the first year of the pandemic, we were starting to build this out. And the three main housing funders, VHFA, Vermont Housing Finance Agency, VHCB, Vermont Housing Conservation Board, and us, sort of mapped out what we could bring in, all the resources, what we could build. After about a year and a half, that goal quickly dropped to about 4,000 units. We've seen housing costs rise between 30 and 40%, the cost of construction year over year during this period. We're just not going to have enough money to build the number of units we want to and need to. The VHIP program at the average cost is about $56,000 per unit we're bringing online. The most recent low-income housing tax credit, I'm on the VHFA board that we just reviewed the other day. The average cost for an 800 square foot apartment is about $450,000 per unit now. So the costs are out of control.
Yeah. Representative Clifford, then Seville.
I'm good.
Representative Seville.
Answer my question.
Thanks for your testimony. So I am interested in how we can kind of keep track of what is being built.
Mm-hmm.
So is that something that the administration is kind of thinking about? in terms of how many units, where the units are being built?
Yes, so there's this housing recovery group, which is those three organizations plus Vermont State Housing Authority, which issues the rental vouchers and those Section 8 vouchers that Sue Minter talked about, which used to be viewed as like your ticket to getting out of poverty because 70% of your rent was going to be paid forever, so long as you qualified. That now 80% of those are being turned to DC because people can't find housing to use it. But that group has been.
Can you say that again?
The Section 8 housing vouchers,
Yeah.
which is a federal rental assistance,
They can't find.
which they can't find an apartment.
The voucher on.
Right. And you only have a certain period of time before the voucher has to be returned. And so it's gotten worse. I mean, a year ago, we were complaining that it was 50 or 60%, only 50 or 60% success rate. Now it's a 20% success rate. Anyone that has been able to, take opportunity of our housing crisis and then, come in and buy some of this property, invest, they're not renting to folks with Section 8 vouchers. And the rents have been jacked up that maybe are above that voucher rate. And so it's becoming harder and harder and just there's no moving going on. The moving rates, I forget what the stat was, but it's something like the number of moves in Vermont is reduced by like 80% in the last few years. So people are stuck and they're not leaving their housing because they know they won't find any more. But the original question, yes, we've done that informally as part of this group to try to keep track of how many we're building with this money and how many are dedicated to those exiting homelessness, because we've had a commitment that at least 30% of all affordable housing we build is going to be reserved for folks exiting homelessness. Under the VHIP program, we've been doing 70% so far. And with our affordable housing partners at VHBA and VHCB, they've been, those larger developments have been reserving 30% of the units. So we're keeping track for that to try to as these programs wind down, see if we'll be successful in housing folks. Unfortunately, we've rehoused 2,800 homeless families, but there's 2,800 more now in the system. So we can't match those up. That's the hard reality. But there's an annual report we do called the Housing Budget and Investment Report that we submit to the legislature every year, which adds up what has been invested in housing development from federal, state, and other sources, as well as the social service investments through AHS, the rental assistance, the homeless shelters. So we already have the inputs of the dollars into the program. What's really hard to do on the number side is, are you counting each year the number of units you supported that have yet been built, or do you want to count the number of units that came on that one year? Because you could fund in 1 year and the investments actually don't benefit anyone to 3 or 4 years down the road, because that's how long it takes. And so I think that the challenge, not that it can't be done, it's just, my vision would be do both. Here's what each year we combined invested in, unduplicated count, because you have a lot of duplication in these numbers. One agency says because that's what they funded. But the reality is when you add them all up and you sort out the duplication, there's one set of total housing investments in 1 year, and then another set of how many units were completed in 1 year, which were probably a combination of funding over the last 5 years that just happened to be completed in 1 year. So it gets the numbers get very confusing very fast.
Thank you.
Representative Cliff.
I do have a question. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your testimony.
Yeah.
There was supposed to be a plan that was due the 15th of April, a couple days ago. That was, I remember, discussed in January regarding the voucher program and the hotel voucher program.
If there is, I'm not on that committee.
I remember it was being addressed at the meeting at the pavilion.
Yeah.
About that. And they said there was going to be a study or a plan as to where we go forward.
Right.
And it was supposed to be due on the 15th of April.
I will check. I mean, the hard facts are there are still people that are in these motel and hotel programs. Yeah. And there are programs that are winding down, and there's 3 times as many affordable housing units coming online than there ever was before, with more reserved for folks that are exiting homelessness, but there's still a gap. And I'm not sure exactly which report that is, because there's been about 3 or 4 different studies or plans that have had the basic charge of show us how you're going to solve the homeless problem. And you get to the end of that period, and then it's like, well, it hasn't been solved. So do another plan to solve. And it comes back to the 2 or 3 legs of the stool, 3 legs. But the number one is supply. There isn't enough supply of housing. Number 2 is you need rental assistance vouchers, which we have more of than we ever had. And they're being sent back because there isn't supply. And then the other is supports and services. So folks that are in need of that can be successfully housed. And there's more money than ever for that. But those agencies and that capacity is stretched so thin that is struggling at this point as well.
No, I get all that. I just remember that, that date.
Okay.
That's what I was curious about.
I'll look into that.
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony.
Okay, thanks.
Great. What?
Any more questions?
Oh, Representative Sakowicz, sorry.
Thanks. That's good. Thank you. Do we know how much of the recent increases in housing costs to build, the building costs, how much of that increase is caused by the tremendous amounts of money that we're actually putting into building, that we're allocating for instance, like we're putting a lot of extra pressure on a system that doesn't seem like it has a lot of capacity to expand to. So it's, that simple supply versus demand. And so I'm just wondering if we have a sense of there's got to be at least some part, maybe it's really tiny, but maybe it's not.
Right. We're paying a premium because we don't have enough. I don't know what a number like that would be, but we do see when we look at even projects we funded, and then they, now go out for their final bids, the increases have all gone up, but not in every area. We can see which products, and like the most recent one was, steel and mechanical systems, 65% increase from when they bid the project just 6 months ago. So it's really dependent, but I understand the nature of your question. And I'm sure there's
the amount of money we're putting into it. Is the amount of money we're putting into these programs actually causing prices to go up?
We're competing against ourselves and all of our other states, infrastructure, climate change investments, all of that. I think the inflation and the Federal Reserve would support what you're saying, but the counter is, do you not do anything and wait? I don't have
That's just like kind of the question of what do we do with that information? But I'm wondering, do we even have a handle on how much of this cost increase problem is sort of our own making?
Yeah. With a completely uneducated, but I think there's a relationship to the inflation, the CPI we're seeing. That's probably, you can account that some of these costs, that's about what we're paying as a premium because we're competing against a shortage of supply. And we're all paying a premium for everything. And but I can't give you an exact number. I don't think that the way that the bids come back from, the big GCs and projects, they don't look at it that way. They tell you the increase in their labor costs, in their materials, their supplies, all interest rates, all those things have all gone up and added.
It just seems like it's a really important part of the picture is how is our policy actually driving costs? And so I don't know who would be doing this kind of study, but there could be folks out there who are sort of modeling this and thinking, well, if we weren't investing quite this much money in this area, we would see less growth in costs because the demand wouldn't be so high. And if anybody's kind of doing that work in those areas, it just seems like it would be really important for us to know so that because we want to spend money efficiently, we want to get the most bang for our buck. And there's a certain point at which you spend more money, but you don't actually get anything because you just increased your own costs. And that would be really extreme. I'm sure we're not close to that, but it would be nice to know kind of like where along that line.
We did a cost study in 2019. So it was before the pandemic, and we were seeing our costs already increase then. We're seeing our affordable housing costs in Vermont increase at a higher rate than our other New England states. Have that study, can share it. It's got a lot of recommendations in there that people have been trying to implement. And so that was even before there was all this money to compete against ourselves on. So that's interesting to sort of compare that to what you just presented.
So if we looked at what other states, nearby states are investing compared to like the size of their housing market and compared to what Vermont's doing, we might be able to get some sort of a handle on whether prices in Vermont are going up faster than other places, maybe because we're investing money.
Yeah, I mean, my example was, but it was before we were investing more money, we were already seeing those cost escalations. So there could be not a universal way to sort of quantify that theory because it was already happening before we had more money in the system. But I will ask one of my data folks at VHFA that has all these cost numbers if there's any way to kind of try to quantify that.
Thanks for your, well, all right, we have our next witnesses and need a break. Representative Tory.
Really quick question for you. Thank you very much. I'm wondering about just your travels. I know you were in my community recently for a housing summit. How successfully towns are doing building housing trusts and capacity for making investments and being prepared to make investments.
Yeah, we've seen an uptick in housing councils and trusts. I think the sort of resources that can be raised are, they're small. So the investments have to be very targeted, otherwise, if you only have $100,000 a year available and you're putting that $100,000 into one $20 million housing project, how much is it really making it happen? Or is it feel good as opposed to really targeted investments? Like if you have an employer that's going to put up a match as well to maybe support a developer that's going to build some housing, and the employer is going to say, I want to ensure that employees have access to that, and you then have a match to leverage that match. I think you see it or small incentives. Woodstock has got an interesting incentive right now to try and encourage folks to rent to long-term tenants as opposed to short-term rentals with $1,000 sign-on sort of bonus. I think it's a mixed bag of what incentives are working, but I'm happy to see communities form these housing committees and these trusts and come up with creative ways and to keep finding, ways to fund them, whether it's 1% option tax or just some ongoing investment. So it's not just a one-time sort of.
Thank you again. All right, members, we're going to take a 5-minute break.